Hey fellow students, my name is Adam Needens and this is my case study for AEP 855, When Ethics and Policies Collide. We're going to start off by getting into some of the facts in the case that we have here, who was involved and the parties and what took place. We'll start off with Richard Inman, who is the first-year assistant junior high principal in the case. There's a young man named James who has a rough background and rough history and past. He was the young man who pawned the brass knuckles off on David Ramos. There is then David Ramos, the honor student who has no previous record of any trouble, who was unfortunately involved in this situation. We also have the campus security officer who had brought the students in for the meeting. Both parents were then notified, so they were involved in the situation as well. And then later on at the end of the case study with Richard Inman, the director of secondary education had to get involved, threatening to reprimand Inman if he doesn't follow through with board policy. So here's our situation and the facts, what we have. Richard Inman has a soft spot for James, who is the troubled youth, and is trying to help him or help them better themselves, not just James, but all of them. He's trying to build a relationship and a rapport with them, which is very commendable and should be done. James was called in by Inman for his third tardy of the week, is how this situation started off. James' fifth period teacher then notified Inman that James was seen passing something off to Ramos before leaving to go down to the office. When Inman was notified of this, he had the campus security officer escort both young gentlemen down to the office as per Inman's request. Ramos appeared scared while in the office, nervous, even intimidated. James is a very intimidating young man, tough 15-year-old gang leader perhaps. Ramos was holding the brass knuckles for James. He was kind of threatened in this situation into perhaps holding on to these brass knuckles for James, in which James later admitted to he wanted to or had intended to use them after school for another reason. Campus police inform Inman then, since they were let into the meeting by Richard Inman, that the campus police has to handcuff both young men and take them to their detention facility for this type of case. And then they should be admitted to the AEP for 45 days following this to continue their education there. The school has a zero tolerance policy on this. Excuse me. This is why this is such a tough situation here. James had admitted that they were his and that he had threatened Ramos, but in this case, that didn't matter. Legal and ethical issues. They do have a zero tolerance policy, and that's where a lot of this is stemming from, that Inman now doesn't have much of a choice. No one was harmed yet in this situation that we know of. James did admit that he was going to use those brass knuckles, however, later on after school for a different situation. So perhaps something was saved of this. David Ramos is the fall guy basically for James and was put in this situation by him, and Inman is put in this situation after agreeing, by him and Inman, and then after agreeing to hold the brass knuckles for James. There's a zero tolerance policy in place, and that both boys have broken that policy. James admitted to making threats to Ramos. If he did not hold the brass knuckles, he was planning to follow through on those threats. Inman is not following school board policy here by not following the proper paperwork on Ramos to continue his 45 days in the AEP program. Here's our overview of what we have thus far in this case, in this situation, dealing with the ethics here. Richard Inman put himself and two students in a very tough situation by calling everyone into his office at the same time to go over an incident that has really yet to occur. What I mean by this, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this. Inman made that decision to call the campus security officer and leave him in there along with the two boys at the same time. The campus security officer then notified Inman that he had no choice but to handcuff and take them to the detention center based on what has transpired in the meeting. Had Inman followed through on just his tardy follow-up and called James into his office, probably would have been taken care of and sent back to class. David Ramos may not have ever been put in this situation, and excuse me, and Inman then put that campus officer in a no-win situation where the officer was just doing his job in this case. Had Inman just called him in one at a time, maybe a lot of this doesn't happen. However, you look at the big picture, and with the brass knuckles, maybe something worse was going to transpire down the road. People involved in this case. Richard Inman, the first-year assistant principal who we know about, that we've been talking about from the South Side, willing to work and help on relationships with the troubled youth is what we know about him. Seems like a pretty good principal, pretty good leader, and guy for this school. James, a 15-year-old, tough, leader of the group, seems to be improving, however, under Inman's guidance, perhaps. David Ramos, from what we know, is a very well-respected student, honor student perhaps, involved in school activities, band, things like that, and he's never on anybody's radar for poor behavior and doesn't have a history of that. The campus officer is involved in this. He was the one that brought the boys into the office and stayed for the meeting. Then the director of secondary education comes involved at the very end, informing Inman to do his job properly and follow the policies that are in place, or he will be reprimanded for such action. Two other people involved were James's parents and David Ramos's parents, who were notified. Their reactions were a little bit different. James's parents were notified and said, well, let's let him sit in there and maybe this time he'll figure it out, as being James has had a history of being in trouble in the past. David Ramos's parents, being David Ramos, has not had a history of such situations. His parents are up at the school 15 minutes later trying to figure out exactly what had happened in this situation. Where this is taking place at. We are in Rocket Junior High, south side of the city. This school, this junior high school, has 900 students in it. Seems to be a very diversified student population. It is tending to be public education, and this incident happened at school. Excuse me. Quick review here. And go through some of these questions for our case. Could the conflict, the situation, or the decision be damaging to the stakeholders or to the community? It's absolutely could be damaging to Mr. Inman here in this situation, depending on how he continues to follow up and handle this situation. Could be really damaging to both young men. You looked at James, from what we know in the case, is that he's starting to behave a little bit better and trend in the right direction, maybe has a positive future. Will this set him back? You look at David Ramos, somebody who's never been in trouble, doesn't have a history of this. Is this something that turns him in a negative direction, or can he overcome this, or is this something that down the road stifles his education in the future, perhaps college and things moving forward? What individuals and groups have an important stake in this outcome? I believe everybody involved in this has a very important stake in this outcome. The campus police officer, maybe not so much, he's just doing his job. And the director of secondary education is following through on his job as well, doing what he's supposed to be doing. So you look at Mr. Inman and you look at the two young boys and their parents, and you got to make some very well-educated decisions here. Have all the relevant stakeholders been consulted? At this point, parents were notified, which would have been the right call. You look at stakeholders being probably the entire school and staff in this situation. He's an assistant principal, so he needs to be discussing with the head principal probably, or any other assistant principals in the case, and then we'll report to the secondary director of secondary education person as well. Can I learn more about this situation? I would have loved to known what led Mr. Inman to call everybody into his office at the same time at the beginning of this situation. Do I know enough to make a decision? I would say I know enough of what I have to do in this situation. It's kind of a tough call here that I don't really like to have to make. I'm very student-centered, and I believe both men are kind of put in bad spots, as well as the principal kind of put himself in a bad spot here. So here we go. We've got some options to look at. I could sign the paperwork and have both boys admitted into the AEP as board policy. This results in me keeping my job and following the policy the way that it has been written. It also means that at least one young man is unfairly punished in this role in this situation, or maybe both. I could not file the paperwork, form an appeal process, and try to get both boys out and keep this off their record. This helps both young men now and in the future. However, this could have serious consequences for me as a professional. I could file the paperwork and have both boys admitted, but try to keep it off their record so it doesn't follow them. So we're kind of looking at a split perhaps. Ramos has a clean slate and James can continue his positive progression he has been on. In any of these cases, I need to look at the overall effect that it's going to have on the school, myself, the boys, their families, and the community. Let's go through some pros and cons for the stakeholders. Pros for our stakeholders involved in this situation here. I make the proper decision to help out these boys, and you got to look at the positive effects now and in their future. You look at some cons for these boys, and myself is, well, I'm going to get reprimanded for sure. And then you got to look at the boys' cons of, well, once again, we're in this program here, and we have this stigma following us down the road. The school, the community, how are these things handled? Is this how it's supposed to be handled? Is this how it's going to be handled in the future? Is every case different? You're going to have a lot of questions to answer depending on how this situation gets handled. And then we need to evaluate all of our options. Let's make a decision. With the information I have to go on from this case study, I feel that it's in this circumstance, the way this is already played out, that I would have no other option but to comply with school board policy at this point and file the proper paperwork. I would, however, make sure that it was noted exactly how it was all played out, what was said, and how this unraveled. I feel that had Mr. Inman not called both boys and the officer into his office at the same time and just called each boy in individually, that this would have played out differently and there wouldn't have been the suspensions. There is also the scenario, however, that the brass knuckles would have been used by James later on, and therefore maybe some harm and trouble was saved. Implementation of this process. At this point, I have to follow through on the paperwork, file the forms for both boys regarding their stint at the detention facility, and then the 45 days in our AEP. I would notify the parents and the director of secondary education of my decision. I would have a file sent in that states all of the following. Exactly how the situation played out, the time, the order, the people, and etc., what was going on. What was said by each individual, the previous records of both boys. I think this is very important. My own faults and mistakes in how I handled everything, and the fact that David Ramos doesn't deserve to have this on his record. At this point, I would like to make contact with the parents and the students involved and explain to them how I felt about the situation and that I feel I personally made some mistakes in this case. After the way I handled this case at the beginning, I wasn't left with much choice other than what I tried to do here. I will look into whether or not both young men can somehow erase this from their record and continue to move on in positive directions, as I feel they are both doing. I will personally be looking out for these two young men from now on and hope that they continue the relationship with me. That was my case study for AEP 855, When Ethics and Policies Collide. Thank you.